The following is 3 trip reports given by Red, Black and Blue regarding their experience with cactus extract, DMT, and cannabis. From Red. Preparation: I boiled down 1 foot of cactus per person for roughly 3.5 hours a dose, and had roughly 150 mg of Mimosa hostilis extracted DMT. Prior experience: I had extensive experience with psychedelics going into this trip, having tried mescaline and DMT previously, as well as LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, ketamine, and various RCs. Location: the beach. Mindset: relatively upbeat mood. Was looking forward to a pleasant day on the beach. The trip. Blue, Black, and I arrived at the beach roughly around 2:25 and settled to begin drinking the 8-ounce each cactus extract. Drinking a carbonated beverage in between drinking the juice facilitated the process. The taste was bitter, but definitely an improvement from the taste of despair that my first attempt at extracting yielded. Upon finishing, we all sat around looking upon the water. A strong sense of anticipation built up just in the 30 minutes of drinking the cactus. By the time we finished drinking, I noticed that my mindset had changed. It felt as though I was entering a dream, with the world around me becoming dulled and I becoming detached from the world around me. While I felt different, my inner monologue was trying to convince myself that the trip to come was going to be mild and even underwhelming. I started to feel restless and suggested to Blue and Black that we go for a stroll. It was at this time that Black spotted a cliff jutting out into the ocean in the distance. Black and I were under the impression that it was at most a 15 to 20 minute walk, and so we all walked in that direction. We walked on sand in tennis shoes, and yet I didn't feel any discomfort. Approximately 45 minutes in, we began to notice that our destination was much further away than we had anticipated. We weren't discouraged and trudged on, humorously reflecting on how life must appear from those who own mansions on the cliffs overlooking the beach. At this point, I felt both stimulated and sedated. The water was shifting colors, with bright purple being the dominant color. I also spent a lot of time observing the patterns of the footprints along the sand, as well as musing on the spontaneous order of the individuals at the beach, about how, without direction, people of various backgrounds, classes, ethnicities, beliefs, and age were able to coexist and enjoy themselves in the midst of each other while ignoring everyone else around them. Not an original thought or particularly insightful, but it was fun to muse over it. I eventually mentally kicked myself for the silly thought, amused at the absurdity of such an intricate and complex thought being produced aimlessly. We arrived to the destined cliff at about 4:30. After walking up the trail to the top for about 15 minutes, we were ecstatic at the view. The sun was beginning to set, and the scene completely serene. It was at this point that we found a small crevice where at least one of us could lay down, legs outstretched to smoke DMT. I went first, feeling a sense of courage and confidence, as well as total excitement at the prospect of smoking DMT on mescaline overlooking a beach while the sun was setting. I brought a small pipe, in which I put a layer of marijuana, then poured out roughly 40 mg of the DMT, and then put an additional layer on top. I then took 3 deep inhalations of the DMT. The first hit began a process of rushing me somewhere. The feeling of being at the peak of a roller coaster just as it began its descent was dominant. The second hit initiated a dissolving of the scene I was overlooking, which was roughly the top half being the sky, and the lower half being the ocean, with small fractals exploding, spinning, and buzzing out of the horizon where ocean and sky met. In addition, I had the sense that a large bubble had encompassed the world around me. The third hit caused my heart to race. Upon exhaling, I had the sense of being bombarded with lessons/insights/epiphanies about life, death and living in and for the moment. Meanwhile, I stared intently at the foamy water washing up on the sand. The patterns of the receding water spiraled, and at this point I became disconnected as my ego zoomed through an endless, bright, colorful fractal. I was overwhelmed with the message that life was a cosmic joke, a recurring theme in my psychedelic experiences, with the meta implied, from one of the unseen messengers in the trip, message that I was slowly getting the joke. It was at this point that a grin came over my face and a tear fell out of my eye at the beautiful and hilarious message. I felt that the DMT was wearing, so I requested that Black hand me over the pipe so I could take one more hit, which prolonged the fading feeling. Next, Black took his hits, followed by Blue. I knew that both he and Blue were in store for a remarkable experience. After their experiences, we watched the sunset. It was approximately 5:20, according to a picture I took of it at the time. Lingering around for 10 minutes or so, we knew we had to get back to the car, which was presumably a far walk away. We began walking across a parking lot, which we did in silence, and then down a road, which we soon discovered would have made it possible to walk on concrete to our destination much faster. We were mostly silent in our 30-minute walk to the car. I was wrapped in a transparent psychedelic glaze which pulsated. I felt quite electrified and felt as though I was buzzing. As darkness fell, we looked back towards the direction from which we came and could not see it due to the darkness. This was all too perfect, as we began to feel as though the entire time on the cliff were a dream, and that the arrival and walk to the cliff were a long time ago, when they were all within 4 hours. We also noted a pattern in which small periods of time felt like eternities, but larger periods of time felt brief, in that a few minutes of walking felt like an hour, whereas an hour felt very brief. Upon arriving to the car, it was clear that we were in no condition to drive yet. Black turned on some Led Zeppelin which was terrific. Every escalation in the music could be felt, and the final guitar solo was magical. For the next hour, I felt extremely euphoric, a feeling accompanied by a very warm and comforting feeling in my chest. At some point after 7, I went for a brief walk alone, in order to fend off a creeping claustrophobia and paranoia. Coming back I felt that I had dropped off a tad bit closer to baseline. Blue offered to drive, claiming he was feeling relatively competent. We drove off to a Subway and, after awkwardly ordering, we sat in silence as we ate, wolfing down our food and then staring off, either at the moving floor tiles, the buzzing/breathing walls, or the spinning tabletop. The ride back home went relatively smoothly, and the psychedelic grip was easing. Getting back home, I laid on the couch with my dogs, reflecting on the absurdity of existence, the trip, and whether or not ignorance is bliss. Waking up the next day, I felt drained, with a feeling akin to the day after MDMA use. The feeling continued for about 2 days. 2 weeks since the trip, I can say it was definitely a wonderful experience. From Black. Substances: 8 ounces of San Pedro cactus extract, mescaline. 40 milligrams of DMT. Cannabis. Prior experience: cannabis, mescaline, psilocybin, salvia, 4-HO-MIPT. Location: beach. Mindset: anxious. Trip: blue, red, and I got to the beach at about 2:30. We began drinking the cactus extract and cola to mask the bad taste. Once finished we went for a walk on the sand. I spotted a cliff out in the distance and thought the base might be a good spot to smoke the DMT and cannabis. At this time I had begun to feel the effects of the mescaline: lightheaded, numbness, sparkling of the water seemed systematic. About halfway to the cliff we realized it was actually miles from our starting point, but we decided to keep on going. Compared to my last encounter with mescaline, this at first felt like a very weak trip. We eventually reach the cliff and see that there is a path from the beach that leads up to the top. We take the path up and are surprised by the beauty that can be seen from there. The sun was setting, the tide was striking the rocks at the bottom, making the water around them foamy. We found a spot at the edge of the cliff that was perfect for what we were about to do. Red took his hits first. After inhaling a few times, Red began to smile. After a few minutes I saw a tear come down his face, and I knew this was going to be an epic experience. Once he was able to stand, he began to prepare the pipe for my turn. As I sat I turned my iPod to Pink Floyd's Shine On You Crazy Diamond. I braced myself for the harsh smoke, and inhaled about 3 times. I immediately began feeling myself dive into a different world, but before it took me completely I took another hit. I was beyond mesmerized as the scenery exploded with rainbows and life. The entire universe seemed to sway to the beat of Pink Floyd's masterpiece. There was a million dolphins jumping in the ocean, and the surrounding cliffs were taking the shapes of elephants and dogs. I could feel my mind climbing higher with the rising tempo of the song. The sun was sinking lower towards the horizon but shining brighter than I had ever seen when Roger Waters began singing, "Shine On You, Crazy Diamond." Right when he began singing this, the sun exploded. Its rays reached out and grabbed me, taking me with it back to the center of the sun. There are no words in any language that could ever hope to accurately describe what this felt like. That was the most spiritual and significant experience I have ever felt. I don't remember how long I was in the sun because my perception of time had dissolved. Eventually, I came back to the cliff but I was still tripping hard, with the DMT and the mescaline both going strong. I stared at the path of light that reflected off the water. This path began to spread apart like with Moses. Once I was down enough, I moved so that Blue could take his hits. After his turn, the 3 of us stood around on the cliff staring out at the ocean and the sunset. Once the sun was almost gone, we decided to head back to the car. During the walk back we were almost completely silent. I began to reflect upon my life and the choices I was making. I couldn't help but be brutally honest about my own personality and the way I had treated others in the past. I was humbled when I attempted to grasp the overwhelming immensity of existence and felt a deep sorrow because humans failed to realize the futility of their ambitions. By the time we reached the car, it had gotten dark. I wasn't down enough to drive yet, so we sat in the car and I turned on some Zeppelin. The music felt magnificent and the solo at the end was amazing. After a while Blue felt ready to drive, so we drove to Subway. We grabbed a bite to eat and drove home. After dropping off Red and Blue, I drove to a party I had been invited to. I sat around with some friends but could not utter a word. I was still trying to sort through everything I had seen, felt, and thought. The following few days I felt very tired but very peaceful. I don't think any of us were expecting a trip of that magnitude, but it was an incredible mix of substances. From Blue. Substances: 8 ounces of San Pedro cactus extract, mescaline. 40 milligrams of DMT. Cannabis. Prior experience: cannabis, psilocybin, DMT. Location: beach, Malibu. Mindset: curious. The trip. Red, Black, and myself arrived to Point Dume, Malibu around 2:30 in the afternoon. Once there we dropped into a local grocery and picked up some sodas in order to counteract the bitterness of the cactus extract. The day was clear and my expectations were high as I was anticipating how the mescaline would react within me. At first I noticed subtle changes happening, such as the white noise of the beach was slightly toned down into just our circle, an elevated change in mood, I guess, which can be only as a slight euphoria sweep over me. Still I was convinced that the mescaline hadn't really done much. A bit later on Blue suggested we head out for a walk along the beach, and that's when things got interesting. As Red, Black, and myself walked along the beach. As we trekked across the sand it seemed as if I were detached from all the people around. They were there going about the day and I was just wondering if they knew how fucked up we were / about to get. The walk was pleasant. We talked about how disgustingly rich the people who lived along the beach were, among other things. I also noticed that the water seemed to turn almost a very light lavenderish color, but nothing too serious. After a while Black noticed Point Dume on the far end of the beach. I still had a good grip on time and knew we were in for quite the walk. It seemed like we had walked miles across the sand, but we finally reached the cliff. Looking for optimal spot to take the DMT, we hiked up the short trail onto the cliff. Fuck me. We made it there at just the right time. The sun was already beginning its descent into the horizon. Once there Red and Black found a little crevice overlooking the southwest edge of the beach. Nobody seemed to mind what we were up to. Red went first and got his dosage of DMT and chilled out for what it seemed to be 20 minutes, but was actually 10 or so. The look on his face was a mixture of things, but all in all I've almost never sensed so much joy. Next Black had a go at it and he came prepped with his iPod in hand. It was Black's first trip with DMT that day and my first trip was earlier that week. I told him that he might have the urge to get up and move around, but he stayed still and drifted off. I went over to the other part of the cliff while Red and Black were still riding out the DMT. At that time I was just taking in all of the natural beauty, and it just made me think how small humans are in comparison to the earth and vast nature is. We really don't take the time to slow down and really enjoy it. Also at this time I was watching the people below, lovers, took some pictures, and took a photo of an Asian couple as the plastic smell of the DMT wafted just nearby. Soon after it was my turn, which seemed to take forever. I got comfortable and took 3 or 4 deep hits of the DMT. I laid back slightly and drifted into the sky. Soon after, I don't know what it was, I just got the urge to get up and move and I immediately turned my attention to the sun. I tried hard not to be swept up in it and stare directly at it, but it was just too damn beautiful. At this time me and Black were in disbelief on what was taking place, and Red and myself were seeing round fractals in the distance with greenish rings around them. On the way back as it was getting dark, that's when things got interesting. I don't know if it was my previous experience with DMT or what, but I just gave my life a hard look at where I was headed in life and how I can myself better as a person and accept who I am completely. We were quiet for a bit, and in this time we realized, why didn't we just walk to the cliff on the pavement instead of the sand, which would have saved us a few extra steps. At this point in the trip the DMT kicked in the mescaline hard. The idea of time was completely destroyed and it seemed as if none of this had actually taken place. Also at this time as I watched the light fade it seemed as if the earth was a giant eye and it was basically shutting, thus concluding the day. Luckily I had made a mental note and remembered where we had parked the car that night, so we headed in to get out of the cold and reflect. At this time Black was still tripping pretty hard and Red had took a walk to shake off what had happened. Whilst in the car we listened to some Led Zeppelin and holy hell it was lovely. It reminded me on a previous shroom trip where I felt the music. We stayed in the car for about an hour but then were concerned on how long we could actually stay there. I was feeling up to driving and we took the car up the street into a plaza where we decided to get some Subway. While ordering the food I knew the employees could tell we were on something and they were just fucking with me a little but they cool. So we sat there eating our meal and drifted off looking around while listening to this guy who was playing all this Bay Area, SoCal 90s gangsta rap. Entertaining. The car ride back was a trip too. For a moment it didn't seem real. Once I had my bearings, I drove Black's car through the canyons and over the freeway, but as we kept going my tensions eased and we all made it back safe and sound back home. The days following the trip my brain was fried. I've never felt that tired in my life and I wasn't the only one who could tell. In the end it was hard to wrap my mind around what had exactly taken place that day and what we had done. It was a very spiritual and moving experience, hopefully for not just myself but for Red and Black as well. I just wish that I could enjoy a moment in life as I did with 3 substances.